Hormones are chemical messengers that are produced in the body to maintain homeostasis. They are released in the blood, which carry them through circulation to the target cells. In the target cells, these hormones bind to their specific receptors and play an important role in variety of metabolic functions like cell death, immune, reproductive development, mood swings, hunger, etc. Hormones. What are hormones? Hormones are chemical substances that are synthesized in the body, that is, in very small quantities. Once synthesized from the endocrine organ, they enter the blood circulation, and through the blood circulation they are carried to their target organs or tissues. Once they reach the target organs, they exert biochemical regulation and metabolic events. They are very similar to enzymes in that they act as a catalyst, and they are produced in small quantities and are not used up during the reaction. They are structurally not always proteins. So hormones differ from enzymes that they are not used up in the same organ where they are produced. They are usually secreted in the blood, and then they are carried by circulation to the target organs. And hormones are different from enzymes because they are structurally not always proteins. Hormones can be classified according to their chemical nature and according to their mode of action. According to their chemical nature, they could be a protein or a peptide hormone, or an amino acid derivative, or a steroid hormones. According to their mode of action, they can act through the secondary messenger cyclic AMP, or they can travel to the nuclear and affect the nuclear transcription, or they can be acting by binding to the receptors or at the translational level. These are the various factors that regulate hormone action. One is the way how they are synthesized, the rate of synthesis and the way they are synthesized, and the control is at the amount of hormone it is secreted, when and how, and the transport system, the receptors at the target organs, and ultimately the biological activity, how long is it active, and the degradation at the liver or the kidneys. Peptide hormones consist of polypeptide chain. Example is oxytocin or growth hormones. The picture shows the protein structures of these peptide hormones. These peptide hormones are much larger than those that are derived from cholesterol, the steroids, or the amino acid derivatives. The amino acid derivative hormones are those that end with I and E. These are derived from amino acid tyrosine and tryptophan. These are water-soluble hormones. Amino acid derivative hormones and protein hormones are water-soluble. The picture shows the structure of the amino acid and also the structure of the hormone epinephrine and melatonin. Most lipid hormones are steroid hormones that are derived as phospholipids and cholesterol. These are insoluble in water. Steroid hormones end with OL or ONE. Examples of steroid hormones are shown in the picture. It also shows the structure of the cholesterol from which testosterone and estradiol is synthesized. This slide is a summary of what we learned and examples of hormones from each of the category. The various steps in hormonal signaling are synthesis of an hormone at its particular tissue or in the endocrine organ. Then it is stored there, and at the correct time it is secreted into the circulation. Further, they are then transported to their target tissues. At the target tissue, the hormone binds to its receptor. Depending on whether it is a water-soluble or a lipid-soluble hormone, the function of the receptor and the hormone and mode of action differs. Then, a relay of amplification of the signal received at the receptor is then continued as a signal transduction process. Feedback mechanisms help in control of the hormone at the producing cell, and also degradation of the hormone by controls the biological activity of this hormone in the tissue cells. Water-soluble hormones cannot enter the cell directly through the hydrophobic cell wall. So they bind to the hormone receptors on the cell membrane. Binding of a ligand to its receptor starts a cascade of secondary messenger molecules. These secondary messenger molecules amplify the signal and continue the signal transduction process. Generally, peptide hormones are water soluble and they produce fast responses. The function of a protein hormone is shown here. The hormone at number 1, step 1, the hormone binds to the receptor at the plasma membrane of the target cell. The second step, the hormone binding to its receptor activates the enzyme that catalyzes the synthesis of the secondary messengers such as cyclic AMP. Now, this activated cyclic AMP then catalyzes a specific reaction. Now, here the amplification takes place. Now, the secondary messenger activates other enzymes and thereby the hormonal action is mediated. The steroid hormones are lipid-based hormones, so they can easily enter the cell and also into the nucleus, binding to its receptor. Once they are inside the nucleus, they are able to bind to the specific sites on the DNA, on the chromatin, activating specific mRNA transcripts. Thereby, they are able to control at the transcriptional level. Here, a steroid hormone binds to its receptor after it has diffused through the plasma membrane. In step 2, you can see the hormone binds to its receptor in the nucleus or the receptor in the cytoplasm, and binding of the hormone to the receptor, then the complex moves into the DNA and it binds DNA. Binding of hormone to DNA causes the DNA transcription start. So RNA polymerase binds to the nearby promoter and the gene transcription begins. So it causes activation of the genes. RNA polymerase then catalyzes transcription to form messenger RNA. Finally, the messenger RNA leaves the nucleus and attaches to the ribosome, where synthesis of the protein continues. So the steroid hormones are activating at the nuclear level. By activating genes, thereby they are increasing the synthesis of specific protein product to mediate their action. There are a number of limiting factors that affect the mode of action. The amount of hormone molecules available, its concentration in the circulation is affected by the amount of hormones produced and secreted. The concentration of hormone-bound receptor complex depends on the concentration of hormone and the concentration of receptor that is available and the binding affinity between the two of them. Hormones may be secreted directly in the portal blood circulation, so for direct hormone targeting like the steroids, or they may be present bound to the transport proteins, which act as a reservoir and allow even distribution of hormones throughout the tissue or organ. Control of hormone secretion. Hormonal glands respond to various chemical changes like changing level of ions or nutrients in the blood. This could be in response to the metabolic functions or to the environment. So the neural stimuli are those from the nervous system. The signals from the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system controls the amount of hormonal secretion to induce physiological changes. One hormone might control the secretion of the other hormone, like from the hypothalamus to pituitary and pituitary to the rest of the endocrine glands. Feedback loops are where the hormone levels are controlled by either inhibited by its own production or stimulated by its production, called as positive feedback or negative feedback loops. Here in this picture, we are seeing the examples of these different control systems. A shows where there is low amount of concentration of calcium in the blood, stimulating the parathyroid glands and secretion of parathyroid hormone to balance the blood calcium concentration. In the B, neural stimulation from the preganglionic fibers to the spinal cord acts on the adrenal gland to secrete catecholamines for the flight and the fight responses. In the hormonal controls, you can see the hypothalamus. Hormones from the hypothalamus control and stimulate the anterior pituitary glands, which then secretes hormones that control further down the other endocrine glands, and the hormonal control is established. What is the feedback mechanism? It is where the hormone, the concentration of the hormone regulates the concentration, regulates the secretion of the hormone. So when most hormone feedback mechanisms involve negative feedback loops, that means increasing concentration of the hormone inhibits its secretion. Negative feedback keeps the concentration of the hormone within a narrow range. So negative feedback is when the product, the hormone, feedbacks to decrease its own production, and it makes sure that extreme concentrations are not around. Example, thyroid gland. In prolactin, increasing prolactin has a positive feedback to increase its own production. Thereby, milk production can be increased for an lactating mother. Hypothalamus is a part of the brain that regulates the nervous system, autonomic nervous system, emotions, feeding, satiety, thirst, body temperature, etc. The variety of hormones are released from the hypothalamus. These are peptide hormones that have an axonal transport. Through the nerves, they are transported to the posterior lobe. So here in the picture, you can see the neurons of the ventral hypothalamus are secreting these hormones that through the neuronal transport, the hypothalamic hypophyseal tract, neurohypophysis, they are reaching the posterior lobe, where from the posterior lobe of the pituitary, they are then released oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. The artery, through the arteries connecting hypothalamus to the pituitary, various hypothalamic factors are transported to the anterior pituitary, and from the anterior lobe of pituitary, various hormones are then released into the blood circulation. The important hypothalamic releasing and inhibitory factors are corticotrophin releasing hormone, thyrotrophin releasing hormone, growth hormone, gonadotrophin releasing hormone, prolactin releasing hormone, and melanocyte stimulating hormone. Each of this can be a releasing hormone or a releasing factor called, and it could also be an inhibiting hormone. Thereby, hypothalamus has a control and a feedback mechanism on many of these endocrine functions. The pituitary gland is called the master gland that signals or controls the function of other endocrine glands. The anterior pituitary gland receives signal from the hypothalamus, whether it could be an inhibitory factor or a releasing factor, and then it responds appropriately and thereby controls other endocrine glands. The posterior pituitary receives oxytocin, an antidiuretic hormone from the hypothalamus, and it relays them to the body as necessary. The pituitary hormones are under the positive and the negative feedback from the hypothalamus peptide factors. So that's why they could be an inhibitory factor or a releasing factor. And this is usually called as a feedback mechanism, and thereby the control is at the hypothalamic level, and it controls the amount of hormone that reaches the final target gland. In this photo, you can see to the right that the neurosecretory cell of the hypothalamus is producing oxytocin, an antidiuretic hormone. These are then flowing down and are secreted into the blood via the capillaries of the posterior pituitary, and it reaches the target glands by the blood flow. To the left, you are seeing the neurosecretory cells of the hypothalamus is producing variety of peptide hormones, which could be a releasing factor or an inhibitory factor. These releasing or inhibitory hormones, number 2, are then secreted into the capillaries that are feeding the anterior lobe of the pituitary. So they are coming down to the anterior lobe of the pituitary. In the anterior lobe of the pituitary, the endocrine cells of the pituitary gland then responds. So the endocrine cell of the anterior pituitary secretes hormones in response to these peptide factors from the hypothalamus, and the variety of pituitary hormones then enter the bloodstream to affect the target endocrine glands. A trophic hormone is one which influences the activity of other endocrine glands, and examples are shown in those hormones involved in stress management and reproduction. Trophic hormones are carried by the blood to the other target glands. In this photo, you can see the examples of hormones that have trophic effects only, and those have non-trophic effects, and growth hormone has both the effect. So the photo shows the neurosecretory cells of hypothalamus producing hormones which are then coming to the anterior pituitary and posterior pituitary, and the variety of hormones from the pituitary is shown, and the target tissues are shown here. The pituitary hormones are listed here. The follicle stimulating hormone is important in the ovary function. Luteinizing hormone is important in the maturation of the egg and the menstrual cycle. Thyroid stimulating hormone is important to stimulate thyroxine from the thyroid gland. ACTH hormone is acting on the adrenal gland to release cortisol. The melanocyte stimulating hormone is important for the synthesis of the skin pigments, the skin pigmentation. Growth hormone is important for the skeletal growth and it plays an important role during infancy and puberty. Antidiuretic hormone signals the kidney to conserve water. And oxytocin is important for lactation and childbirth. Various releasing factors or hormones regulate the anterior pituitary, which is through the adenohypophysis. So you have the variety of thyroid stimulating hormone, thyrotrophin, and the list goes on. So in the picture, you can see that from the hypothalamus, neurons are synthesizing these trophic hormones and they are releasing them into the capillaries of the portal system. The portal system is which connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland, anterior pituitary gland. So these portal vessels then carry these trophic hormones directly to the anterior pituitary. And from the anterior pituitary, the anterior pituitary glands then release a second set of hormones which are then released into the blood for distribution to the target glands. This picture is the summary of the endocrine system. So here you can see the hypothalamic hormones are listed from left to right. First is prolactin releasing hormone, which increases the prolactin stimulation of the prolactin secretion from the anterior pituitary, and it acts on its target tissue on the breast for milk production for lactation. Next one is TRH, which is acting on thyroid stimulating hormone in the anterior pituitary, which further acts on thyroid gland to produce thyroxine T3 and T4 thyroid hormones. CRH, which is acting on the anterior pituitary gland on the producing the ACTH, adenocorticotrophic hormone, acts on the adrenal cortex to increase cortisol production. Growth hormone inhibitory factor or releasing factor from the hypothalamus acts on the growth hormone secretion in the pituitary, which then acts on liver and variety of growth factors, insulin growth factors, and they are targeted in many tissues for growth and metabolic functions. The gonadotrophin releasing hormone, which is coming down to produce follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone releasing factors from the pituitary glands, and these gonadotrophins then act on the gonads according to the sex and the germ cells of the gonads. It is important to note that these gonadotrophins also are very important to many tissue functions, and they are not only for the reproductive function. The gonadotrophins are also important for many other metabolic functions and have receptors in many tissues. Anterior pituitary produces growth hormone, which is important to promote mitosis, cell division, elongation of bones, wound healing, etc. Lack of human growth hormone retards growth, leads to the short stature, cretinism, and dwarfism. Increased production of growth hormone produces gigantism. This increased production of anterior pituitary, when it happens during puberty or infancy during the growth period, then it leads to gigantism. Hypersecretion in adults produces acromegaly, a condition called acromegaly, which is widening of the structures, which finally both gigantism and acromegaly is lethal if the production of growth hormone is not inhibited or taken care of using medicines. To the posterior pituitary, the hypophyseal transport, the axonal transport from the hypothalamus comes through the neurohypophysis. The hypothalamic cell body synthesize oxytocin, an antidiuretic hormone. The primary function of oxytocin is contraction of smooth muscles on the mammary glands and uterus. Estrogen increases the number of oxytocin receptors on these glands while progesterone decreases or inhibits the action. The principal action of antidiuretic hormone is to reabsorb water from the kidney by the distal tubules and the collecting tubules. It does it by stimulating the contraction of smooth muscles and vasoconstriction, increasing the cytosolic calcium concentration. ADH also has a glycogenolytic effect, where glycogenolysis, by which also it increases calcium concentration. Glycogenolysis is production of glycogen, and it has a urea retention effect. Diabetes insipidus. It is produced due to failure in secretion or action of vasopressin or antidiuretic hormone. It is characterized by high volumes of urine output up to 20 to 30 liters per day with very low specific gravity, and clinically it is shown by excessive thirst. There are different types of diabetes insipidus. Primary central or a neurohypophyseal diabetes insipidus is where the vasopressin secretion is poor at the hypothalamus. A nephrogenic diabetes insipidus, which is a secondary diabetes insipidus at the kidney, in this the kidney cannot respond to the vasopressin due to renal damage.